Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today I'm very happy to welcome back to this program someone who I have learned from a great deal over the years just by doing this show, Gary Dorrien. Gary Dorrien is a leading scholar on the history of religion and social movements for justice, from the social gospel in Europe to the American Transcendentalist movement in the early part of this country's history, to the Black social gospel movement of the 20th century. He has written countless books on these, but now he is out with a new book about his own life. It's in fact an intellectual biography. It is called Over from Union Road, My Christian Left Intellectual Life. Gary Dorrien, it is a great pleasure, sir, to welcome you back to this program. Thank you for taking the time.
Oh, thanks, Mitch. It's so great to be with you.
And I should also formally add that you're the Reinhold Niebuhr Professor of Social Ethics at Union Theological Seminary and Professor of Religion at Columbia University. Did you grow up in a religious home?
We were nominally Catholic, so I got to the Catholic Mass just enough to be really caught by something, which is that image of the crucified Jesus overhanging the altar. I was a strange enough child with respect to this issue that though we were only nominally Catholic, my parents could not drag me past either of the Catholic churches in Midland. And of course, we lived outside Midland in this semi-rural area called Bay County. But when we get into town, I just insisted I had to go inside the church. I just love the aura of sacred mystery that was in Catholic churches. And so on Sundays when my parents couldn't get themselves to church, I would hitch a ride with Zapansky's next door. So I had a kind of mystical germ, which is what William James called it, early on, and even had kind of certain kind of reflective, kind of spiritual thoughts when I'm spending so much time by myself out in the backyard. In my growing up years. So there is a real sense in which I am yearning for more religion than I got, but got enough of it to be caught by certain things. And those were the things I just named until the Civil Rights Movement came along, and then that caught me in a very similar way.
William James, you mentioned. This is early 1900s. He publishes and he writes the classic book, The Varieties of Religious Experience. Yes,
in 1902. It's James had a kind of sympathetic ear for religious discourse. He also had his own mystical germ, as he called it. He once wrote to George Gordon, who was a quite famous pastor in Boston in the turn of the century, who was a personalist philosopher himself. And James wrote to him, "You will count me a Methodist minus a savior." So he can't check on certain, Christian creedal doctrines about personal God or divinity of Christ or the like, and yet James recognized in his own personality and sensibility a real kind of religious yearning. In fact, he has something a divided mind between his kind of hard-headed empiricism, in which we must hold fast to the scientific world picture, and then this other sort of quest for meaning, because science doesn't know the meaning of anything, certainly not the spiritual meaning of anything, and he had that as well. So James was himself kind of caught between these warring impulses in himself. And so that's the source of a fair amount of that stuff he wrote in the Varieties about, once born and twice born personalities, and those who have kind of got a sense of sin consciousness and guilt and need to kind of struggle with life, including just themselves, and others who are kind of more aesthetic and smooth and kind of go through life without terrible struggle. And he clearly had a certain attraction to those once born types, but he's definitely, he says most of the great theologians are twice borners, people who struggle and have a lot of doubt and need to kind of thrash with it.
I see William James as in line and maybe the precursor of other figures like Carl Gustav Jung, the psychoanalyst, or Joseph Campbell in the middle of the 20th century. And I see him in that line. Would that be appropriate?
Yes. Well, James was born to high culture and wealth. And that's that famous James family. His father was a famous intellectual in his time, and of course, so was his brother. James does battle. Firstly, he battles with terrible depression. So that's an issue. He doesn't have to worry about how will I live. He's too highborn for that, and kind of born to Harvard, really. And in his early academic career, his great work was the 2-volume Principles of Psychology. So most of what became the later James's philosophy, which is what he's famous for, this pragmatism and radical empiricism, the two kind of pillars of his thought that are kind of original contributions to philosophy that then constitute what is the distinctly American approach to philosophy before the analytic tradition even came along, was William James style pragmatism and William James style radical empiricism. And you can get the kind of fundamental postulates of both really out of this earlier work that he did on psychology. But by the later 1890s, he really has made the turn to teaching in the philosophy department. And even then, James has the requisite kind of humility about what he's doing, that he didn't teach his own work at Harvard. There were people who came to Harvard in 1900 and 1905 and 1910 who wanted to study, what he wrote. And oh no, he would teach Hegel or Borden Parker Bohn or Rudolf Lorze, or the German idealists who were prominent at the time, or British Hegelian idealists like F.H. Bradley. That's what he would teach at Harvard, because he thought, oh no, my own thought is, I shouldn't be teaching that. It's not important enough in philosophy. But he did live long enough to see himself, acquire followers, and people are saying, yeah, pragmatism, that makes a certain sense, and it certainly makes sense for Americans we're not a bunch of metaphysical high flyers anyway. So indeed, he did see himself become prominent in a way he hadn't really expected. But James is always just kind of wonderfully accessible, wonderful writer. And I think the key thing that you were sort of pointing to there, James is an empiricist. He fully respects 18th century empiricism, where it's the scientific method, where you break things down to their smallest possible constitutive parts in order to do experiments and replicate these experiments no matter where you are in the world, and just get your subjectivity out of it, and anything that's cultural, anything that's personal, just make it as scientific as possible. Yes, he is very respectful of that whole mode, and yet he also says, life actually doesn't have these distinctions in them. Life has a kind of flowing continuity that doesn't have these distinct boundaries. So the idea that you can just kind of locate objects in the world and then kind of objectively study them in a way that yields something we call knowledge, well, of course, that yields a great deal of knowledge of a kind, but it tends to be kind of observer knowledge that involves a kind of engineering concept of reason, and there's more to life than that. There's more to thinking than that, far more. So that of course is the principle of what he calls radical empiricism, that you deal with this kind of flowing continuity and the relationships between knowing subjects and objects of sense data are just as important as what's going on in our heads, a la Immanuel Kant, and whatever we think we know about what's out there in the world. So I just an extraordinary figure in so many ways. One of my favorites. And he not only named the Chicago School. When the Chicago School begins to develop a distinct approach to theology and to social science, he says, well, this is something that needs to be named. He calls it the Chicago School, which we've called it ever since. But he also named my field. The field of social ethics. William James one day This Greenwood Peabody is fuxing around with, what do I call what I do here? And it was James who had the idea. Why not call it social ethics? Which is what we've called it ever since.
Something you said earlier that I don't want to lose sight on, and I think it's important, is just the word struggle. Yeah. You said all theologians seem to struggle. I think probably all people seem to struggle. The role that struggle plays. I have, and I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and you'll forgive me for interjecting myself into this. But I've been interested. I did not grow up in a religious background or home, and I'm not, and I mostly have always seen myself as atheist, but not the Richard Dawkins kind of atheist, not the anti-religion kind of person. I've actually even got a minor degree in the history of religion because I saw the importance in it and of these stories and the importance that stories have. And recently I have been reading and I've been interested in writers who, like me, were not born into the church, did not grow up seeing themselves as religious, but came to Christianity later in life. Two particular writers that I find fascinating. C.S. Lewis would be one. Most people know the name of C.S. Lewis for his book Chronicles of Narnia, but in his time he was also really known as a Christian apologist or a defender. And then Leo Tolstoy, who I think wrote this very small book called Confessions, which I found to be a very profound book. And they tried to, and they intellectualize how they became Christians themselves later in life. And what seemed to combine them both was struggle, this idea of struggle. And it kind of led me to believe that, to me, it doesn't even matter if there's an objective, external reality of God or divinity, whatever it may be, that's out there external of me. That's not even the point. That's not even what's important here. But the struggle is real. We've been given these brains and these cognitive capacities that make us reflect on things, and that we need some kind of a story to help us get through the struggle. Like, why do we have to struggle? Why must we struggle? Because if we just think as a combination of a bunch of atoms doing physical things, then what's the purpose in that? And I almost feel like, not that there's a God gene necessarily, but there's something about us that needs a story to give us meaning, because meaning ends up propelling us to get through whatever struggle we need to get through just to survive.
Yeah. Yeah, that's wonderful. Tolstoy also wrote a book, a fabulous book called The Kingdom of God is Within You, in which he explicated, again, as in the Confessions book, his own kind of personal faith, what he got out of this Jesus story. Jesus didn't have a system of doctrine, even including doctrines about himself. He preached the coming kingdom of God, which is in you and all around you and has a telos. You're supposed to do good in the world. So there's a kind of moral religion that is the very religion of Jesus in Tolstoy's rendering. That was his own faith. And of course, Tolstoy gave himself more and more to that faith in his later life. His struggle was with himself, so he certainly had it. He was an example of what James called the twice-born type. Though, and I think it is the case, James was right about this, that most of the great theologians are in fact are struggling types, people like Augustine or Luther or Soren Kierkegaard, people who just struggle with everything and never live a doubt-free day. But I would say on behalf of those it's not like you have to be. I mean, Thomas Aquinas, James thought and was probably right. Thomas Aquinas was a once-born type who there's a kind of smoothness in him, a kind of unruffled, serene spirituality and sensibility, and highly intellectual. Of course, Thomas Aquinas lines up 7 secretaries. They're taking down the Summa. after he said Mass and before, while he's on his way to go teach the Bible, he dictates this massive Summa, which is just the model of scholasticism, and it's wonderful. I mean, you just open it anywhere, are plunged in the middle of some argument where he's looking at it from every angle. So I wouldn't say you have to be a struggler who holds off their despair and is looking for meaning, but I think most theologians really are, and that's why then they communicate with people. People catch it, in their work. They say, "Oh, this being involved in this work isn't about forcing yourself to believe something that's unbelievable. It's entering this journey with people who've been on it before you, and have some things to say that maybe can help you think about what you think."
Because the struggle is real. Everybody does struggle.
Yeah. I think I'd even say, if we're going to just even loop back to this for a moment, thinking about how you began that run there. Immanuel Kant has a section on what he calls the antinomies of reason, near the end of the first critique. And his argument there, he lines out, the best arguments he can think of about for and against the existence of God, the existence of a soul, whether the world had a beginning, and whether we have any freedom. And he says, there is no proof here either way. People who think they can prove something haven't understood the first half of this book that's kind of lined out the limits of reason within what he calls the bounds of sense. And then in this section, he's not trying to fool you about something or tilt the playing field by giving a stronger argument about this but a weaker argument about that. No, he's gone to the strongest arguments he can think of on both sides of it in order to show you, by the time he's gotten to the end of that section, that at the level of what he calls pure reason, you cannot prove or disprove the existence of God, or that the world had a beginning, or that there's a soul, or that we even have freedom. Kant says, and that's, of course, the clincher in a way to Kant. That's what's going to open up moral religion in the critique of practical reason, is that Kant isn't even sure that he has any freedom, and he doesn't have any account for it. He doesn't understand why he thinks he has it. He just knows that he must, because he is impaled on the sheer force of the moral law within him. And he says, it makes no sense at all that I have this compulsion to do good, that I just feel almost assailed by this moral law that's within me, unless I'm actually free enough to be able to act upon it. And of course, that's the gateway into Kant's own, to the extent that there's a theology in Kant, that's, comes out of that.
Yeah, I guess I just feel in a time of struggle, I need some kind of meaning to it, and that could be anything. Personally, if I were to ask, do you believe in an individual, single, and it could be many things, it's not even important actually, but do you believe in God? I'd probably say no, but that's not important, because I know when I am in the deep struggle, I find myself, when I'm alone at night, lights out, asking why. What is the purpose for this? Why am I just struggling needlessly, or is there a purpose to struggle here? And I ask, who am I asking? Who am I asking? Why am I struggling? And that just kind of leads me, and you forgive me, I'm probably getting off course here of where we both should go in our conversation. But I just find that, to me, showing I still need meaning. And we all need meaning. That there's a meaning, that there's a story to our lives. And I do think religion.
That's not the form of it that caught me early on. I mean, I'm out there 9 years old pitching baseballs to a sleeping bag thrown over the clothesline, and there are two things that I would just over and over on, and one is this notion, as they claim, that God is everywhere. It's like, God, what could that possibly mean? If God is everywhere, then God can't be some discrete something out there somewhere. I mean, that already I get. This can't be. I mean, that this is supposedly fundamental, that God is everywhere and in everything. And so just trying to wrap a 9-year-old's mind around that, what concepts you have for it. The one thing, it was clear to me if that, whatever that means, it has to mean that God is not some discrete object, some object among other objects out there. So it's merely it's a kind of a negative belief. And then there's just the sheer force of this strange, fixating, in some grotesque, and yet to me ringing of a certain spiritual truth that represents some kind of religious ideal that I certainly don't have language for, but I catch that there's something so strange and counterintuitive about this faith that, that we have in Christianity, in which the symbol of it is that the God figure suffers and dies on a cross. And that just endlessly fascinated me, repelled me, and kind of held me in a way that made me think that this isn't, whatever this faith business is about, it's not about just trying to believe in something way out there, but there's something profound being said, and it's profound in a way that's not what you'd expect. That in a way, it's so contrary to anything that's commonsensical. That this is the most important thing that can be said about the God figure in this religion. That this God suffered and died on a cross. So whatever that meant, and of course I'm years and years and years away from having any atonement theology. I don't know anything about that. And the only real theology I read before I got to college was Martin Luther King's Stride Toward Freedom. He's got a chapter about theologians in there, and that put some names in my head. But the public library didn't have any of their books, so I had to wait till college till I read any of that. And wow, I was like a kid in a sandbox when I walked into a college library, and now rows and rows and rows of books, not only by theologians, but also by philosophers. Oh my goodness, are you kidding? Because I had exhausted the public library in Midland by then, and was eager to get all I could.
Well, was Ralph Waldo Emerson important to you?
Yes. My junior year, sophomore year of high school, we had a week on Emerson. I was not a good student. I was an inattentive student that the teachers did not like. Always a jock. I would not have survived.
You played a lot of sports. There's a lot of sports in the early part of your
I would not have survived high school without sports. I was a quarterback and a pitcher, and had to play the point in basketball. And my father is an assiduous golfer, so of course I followed him out there and played in his group. So yes, without sports, I simply would not have survived high school, because I hated school, and I couldn't pay attention to the teachers, and they noticed it, so they didn't like me. And I'm in this absurdly overcrowded school, because this is baby boom at its height in schools that just aren't built for it. And later on they were, but I'm the year where just this contradiction just maxes out. I just can't pay attention to these teachers, partly because I am an assiduous reader who's always reading his own books. So the idea of taking a school book home just never occurred to me. It could not happen. You just pay enough attention in class to pass these classes that aren't really that hard, but are just impossible. So I'm a deeply alienated kid in more ways than one. But the one person that kind of and that kind of a just normal school stuff going on, who caught my attention at any point was Emerson. Yeah, that week it caught me. This is interesting. And so I actually paid attention during that section. And then 2 years later, when I'm now a high school senior, and my high school football season went bust because we thought we were going to win the state championship, and we lost the game, and we were all just shattered, and we went in different directions. And now I'm just totally doubling down on this person who read James Baldwin and some books on the civil rights movement, and whatever the public library has about in its meager philosophy section. That part of me just now, without apology, I just kind of double down on being this assiduous autodidactic book reader. And it occurred to me, oh, that's right, there was that Emerson week. Emerson caught me then. Maybe I should go back to him, which I did. And of course, Emerson, the public library did have the Emerson books. So I started taking them home. And indeed, he was the first person besides Martin Luther King himself, because I had read King in the 9th grade. So I had that knocking around in my head all through high school. But Emerson was the first go-to person other than King himself that I went to and got some. Yes, I liked the sensibility of his spiritual philosophy. That it's not churched, and it's definitely spiritual. And there's definitely a kind of philosophical undercurrent to it. It's sophisticated but not inaccessible. Someone who's trying to get what's in it out. You can be a high school senior and get a lot out of Emerson. That's one reason why he's in the American Anthology. Still, to this day, he still gets about 150 pages in the Norton Anthology for that period. So yes, Emerson was my first philosopher who I'm reading along that line. Although I should say, by that point, I had a list of people about who I wanted to get to it sooner or later, because I had read Martin Luther King's account of his own work, and I'd read the biography of King that L.D. Reddick wrote, an insider who wrote about King. I read that book 3 times in the 9th grade, and read it again the next year. So the whole Reddick narrative about who Martin Luther King was and his training at being brought up in his father's church and his schooling at Morehouse and what he learned in seminary, all that kind of thing. That was just heart knowledge to me. I'd memorized vast chunks of those 2 books. And so I did have this idea about there's such a thing as a theologian. It's just not something that would have come up in my somewhat only semi-churched Catholic world. That's not what Father de Russell talked about in these pedestrian sermons he gave at church. You just wouldn't hear about theologians. There's just not, in a pre-Vatican II church, there's just not even a concept of an individual theologian who writes creatively about religious things. Certainly not about interreligious dialogue or theories about the self or anything like that. That just didn't really exist. To grow up Catholic means you're a good person and you believe whatever the church teaches about doctrines and the like. Now, of course, there's a great shift occurred over that very thing once Vatican II occurs, which is during the time when I was in high school when that went on. So that caught up to me eventually as well. I did very assiduously read one Catholic theologian when I went to college, because I thought I've got to at least read one. And if I'm going to read one, well, better read the best one. So that was Karl Rahner.
This is Letters on Politics, and we are in conversation with Gary Dorrien. He is the author of the book Over from Union Road, My Christian Left Intellectual Life. I brought up Ralph Waldo Emerson, and just maybe broadly speaking of the Transcendentalist as well. This is sort of in the middle of the 19th century as an important religious move that has a religious element to it. These are Transcendentalists. My understanding, hard to explain it, but you can sort of see it as Transcendentalists believed that there is the spark in divinity in everyone, and even other species as well, all living things, that there is a spark of divinity. And that was sort of the driving force behind this movement that included others like Henry David Thoreau, And there's a line here that I think you mentioned Martin Luther King Jr. and the impact that he had on you. There's a line that you can draw from the transcendentalists of the 19th century to Martin Luther King Jr. I mean, Henry David Thoreau wrote the essay on civil disobedience, would be one obvious one. But I think there's another important line here, and I try to stress this on the program that I do, is that the United States, America, has a deep leftist, quote unquote, leftist tradition that you can see sort of maybe here at the beginning with the transcendentalists, and maybe before then too, but I'm really thinking of the transcendentalists going all the way up to our modern time, including to MLK, who's not modern anymore, but more modern, obviously.
Yeah. Two things about that. Yes. One, first, philosophically, these two things we've just talked about, the whole transcendentalist tradition in U.S. American thought, and the Black church tradition of preaching about the sacred dignity of every human life, that King is the epitome of. They actually have the same, philosophically, they have the same kind of undercurrent. It's post-Kantian idealism. It's that sort of Kantian argument that the categorical imperative itself is that you never treat a person as a mere means to an end, because every person indeed is endowed with this kind of sacred dignity. And on a philosophical level, of course, Kant has this whole argument about how the mind, we don't just passively take in the real world that's out there, that we all are kind of endowed with these innate capacities for sorting out quantities, qualities, relations, and modalities that take us into the world, such that the mind is active in producing experience. And so there's a way by which you can kind of religiously name the world that comes out of Kantian philosophy that the whole transcendentalist tradition has, and so does Martin Luther King, thinking, well, that's what I heard in the Black church. And so that's why King went to Boston University, because he knew that that's what they teach at Boston University. It's that post-Kantian tradition of personalist philosophy, which has strong affinities with the transcendentalist tradition. The transcendentalists, people like William Ellery Channing and Emerson himself and others, Theodore Parker, certainly Parker thought of himself as being a good Kantian. There are issues here with how to read Kant that makes him, actually, he's more of a post-Kantian, because he is, in fact, spiritualizing Kant's categories of understanding. Parker did not understand Kant himself quite as well as he thought. But this is a tremendous tradition, not just in this country, but also in Europe, of sort of taking Kant in a direction in which Emerson makes great sense. And the interlocutor of that, the person who helped mediates those two things, is Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Because when Emerson read Coleridge, that's what set him free. He's preaching Unitarian sermons, kind of grinding his teeth, because he really doesn't believe in proofs for God's existence, and the amount of Christian doctrine that he's still got needs to preach, preaching in a Boston Unitarian pulpit, Second Church in Boston in the late 1820s. But when he goes back and reads Coleridge, he, like several of all these other transcendentalists, Margaret Fuller was another one, Parker was certainly one, they felt that Coleridge was the person who mediated this whole Kantian tradition of personalism to them, partly because, of course, Coleridge wrote in English, and he's the one mediating this German-speaking tradition to English-speaking people. Parker read German, but hardly any of these other, Fuller did, but hardly any of these other American transcendentalists spoke German, could read it. So they're getting it kind of secondhand through Coleridge. But as Margaret Fuller said, to the uninitiated, Coleridge is nothing. To the initiated, he is everything. He's the prophet of self-liberating, self-authenticating spirit. And so there's definitely a kind of spiritual sensibility, that undercurrent within this transcendentalist movement, that's a philosophical literary movement. And then to some degree, it's also a movement underwriting a fair amount of, as you're suggesting, political radicalism, radical democracy. Although it's very much a mixed bag. as to how far you go with that. And Emerson himself is a kind of exemplar of that. Emerson did support certain radical democratic causes, but he's not one to kind of show up for meetings or being an organizer. He's got a kind of effete, to himself kind of sensibility. He holds himself apart from people, and he gets a little nervous when he's around kind of movement organizer types. And it did cut short his advocacy on the treatment of Native Americans in this country. He definitely had a conscience about it, and yet he didn't do much with it. And in fact, none of them did, because there's a kind of wall that they hit in terms of what you actually do with all these what Emerson called our beautiful sentiments about sacred dignity and democracy, and how that this country needs to become a democracy. We've got democratic ideas, but we're just struggling to create an actual democracy, just as we're struggling even to create a culture. Since, of course, that's the great theme of the Emersonian essay, is that we don't even have a culture. We certainly don't have an intellectual culture. It's just secondhand from England, and we need to create one. And he's the great avatar of that.
For you, how does social justice and religious experience come together?
Well, I teach in a field, social ethics, that got its beginnings right here. These are founding generation of the social gospel, but they're academics. People like Francis Greenwood Peabody and Graham Taylor, and so Peabody was a Unitarian minister, and Taylor was a Congregationalist minister, and others like them in their circle. And they as full kind of social gospel preachers, that is, social gospel teaching that the church needs to be involved in struggles for social justice, that we're simply not being true to the teaching of Jesus, to what Christianity is at its best, if there are movements for reform movements for justice out there, the church needs to be involved in them, supporting them. Otherwise, it's simply betraying its own faith, its own, kingdom-based faith. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as in heaven. A lot of these people, they grew up evangelical, or they just hear that as a message where Jesus is talking about getting yourself to heaven. And then this social gospel movement comes along and says, no, that's not what it's about. I mean, that might be a dimension of it, but what it's about is the kingdom being built in our time, in the world. So they've made that connection, and now the people who founded my field, these are academics saying, well, if that's the case, then we need a whole field of discourse in the seminaries and even in the universities that are our universities, that would say it's our business to study the reform movements, because it's the reform movements that take you into the sites of hurt and harm and pain in society. They're already showing where they are. And so we need to study those and be involved in them. And if we did that, well, that would be work for a whole new field. I mean, you don't do that if you're just studying the Bible or church history or sociology or the like. Although that last example was telling, because my people who founded social ethics thought that this new field of sociology and the new field of social ethics need to be very tightly bound together in order to create a better society, in order to have for the academy to actually be involved in supporting social justice movements that make this country more liberal and more democratic than it was. And of course, the historic name that comes from putting those two things together, liberalism, where everybody has rights that can't be infringed by the government, and democracy, where the majority gets to say what goes down, is if you try to pull those things together, the best parts of those two things, you put them together, that's progressivism. That's exactly what what defined the progressive era. And the social gospel founders who founded the field that I teach, they are progressives to the core. Now it's just a question of how radical are you? Are you an outright socialist, or do you think that, no, we can reform capitalism, that will be enough? And are there mix and matches of that? If you're for cooperatives, as virtually all of them are you already some kind of a socialist? Are you going to say it, or are you going to say, no, we're not socialist, because that scares people? So lots of talk about that in the founding of my field in 1890s, early 1900s. And King inherited all this. When Dr. King went to seminary, this is what he read about. The people who wrote these books, and he's thinking his way into a ministry, a type of ministry that isn't what his father practiced. But his father does have a kind of a social conception of ministry. It just isn't quite this full-blown social gospel that I just described, because that feels like a bridge too far.
Martin Luther King, he's a doctor. He's Dr. Martin Luther King. He has a PhD. Is his PhD in the same field that your field is, in ethics?
Well, actually, King's doctorate is in theology. I mean, theology and social ethics are intertwined. Here, at Union, where I teach, they're actually part of the very same field. But where he went to Crozier Seminary after he went to, he was young at Morehouse, 14 years old already at Morehouse. So he was young coming out of college, then straight to Crozier Seminary, which is in Chester, Pennsylvania, and then to Boston University. And that's not coincidental, because he knows that Boston University is the place where people who know all about this personalist post-Kantian thing I was talking about a little while ago, that's where they go. Not only that, fully half, little more than half of all the African Americans who got PhDs in religious studies in that generation, they got them at one place, Boston University. So it's just known for being the place that if you're somebody like Martin Luther King, you go to BU. To do your graduate work, which he did. Now, he started in philosophy. He's got a pure kind of philosophical version of that post-Kantian argument that I was just saying a while. And his teacher was Edgar Sheffield Brightman, probably the greatest personalist philosopher this country ever produced. Taught long career at BU. And that was his teacher when he went to BU. And studied from her for a year, and then the beginning of the next year, but then Brightman fell ill and died. And so then King had to move to the School of Theology at BU, because he's lost his philosophical mentor at the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. And so he finished his degree in the School of Theology. And so he wrote his doctoral dissertation on the personality of God. And he's steering between two theologies that have a God concept, but not a personal God concept. Henry Nelson Wyman, on one hand, that's the Chicago school, very naturalistic version of theology, a kind of theological behaviorism that's very social scientific. And Paul Tillich on the other side, a great philosophical theologian, but who's not nearly personal enough, doesn't have enough of an emphasis on personal self, personal dignity, or the personality of God that King very much needs. I mean, he knows you don't want to get all your religion educated out of you when you go to school, such that you'd just be useless in a black church context preaching when you leave.
He needed God to have a personality.
Indeed, that a divine reality that has self-consciousness and self-direction. This is what he writes his dissertation about. Kind of steers a path between these two theologies, these two impersonalist theologies that he respects. These were both great sort of theological positions and figures of his time, and King is steering between them in the fashion of the school that he's at. I mean, Boston University is sort of the citadel of this approach to philosophical theology, and so writes a 450-page dissertation on this very thing, steering between these two theologies that are impersonal, making his case for why it is that that personalist philosophy is. He makes this argument that that no theology is stronger than the philosophy it's sitting on. Or to put it differently, that every theology has some kind of philosophy, some kind of philosophical worldview underneath it, some kind of epistemology, some kind of ontology, some kind of argument about some assumption about whether we're free or not, the relation of freedom to determinism, and so on. So the question for Protestant theology is to find the best philosophical system you can to be the undergirding of this. You want a strong theology, not a weak one. And so King goes to the school that can provide that for him. And that's what he says in his chapter called Pilgrimage to Nonviolence. In his chapter, in that chapter of Stride Toward Freedom, he says, I went to the place who could provide that for me, and it has been my foundation, my undergirding ever since. This belief in a personal God who is my kind of source and strength. King preached out of that barrel of sermons that he developed in his 1 year of ministry for the rest of his career. Of course, he was a minister his whole career, but he had just 1 year of every week preaching at a Southern Baptist church in Montgomery before the movement just came along and swept him away.
It gave him meaning.
Oh, definitely.
I'm fixated on meaning, as you know. I'm fixated on this idea of meaning, of finding meaning. And
he had to make a decision about how serious it was for him. I mean, it's not just something he grew up in because his father was a pastor, or that then he studied in seminary, or then even that he's got a PhD in it, so now he's going to teach it. Because he always had this idea that I'll be a pastor, but I'll do some teaching on the side. But then, a year into that experience, the bus boycott movement takes off in December 1955, and by January of the next year, he's in his kitchen, terrified and grieving, frightened out of his mind, frightened for his family, because he's, they just don't even dare pick up the phone any longer because it's just death threats just pouring in. People saying they're going to blow up his house, which they did just the next month, blew it up. And, he had to decide, okay, well, as he said, he had to sort of grow up in the faith in which he'd raised. He had a kind of spiritual experience there, which in the kitchen, where indeed he committed himself to it in a way that just cuts much deeper than what he'd had before. Because what he'd had before, he'd had a pretty good run. He'd had a nice ride, growing up in a middle class Black Baptist church and family, and it gets him to seminary, and now straight to a PhD. And he'd had things pretty much his own way. Got to a good middle class church in Montgomery, where he's very respectable and so on, respected. And now all of a sudden, look where he is. Look what he's been thrown into with no real preparation for it. Now he is falling back on his faith to see him through something that is so much harder than anything that he could have imagined up till then.
And Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is the window for you into this theological world? Not only window. I know you had religious experiences before, as you said. I don't mean only window, but it sounds.
Yeah. No, I was that caught me early on. I mean, just the civil rights movement that's going already. We're on the latter part of grade school, and that march of children in Birmingham. My God, what is that? It's so far away from my lower, working class white world in Bay County, and yet it is the thing that came crashing into me from that world, that I am fixated and now needing to learn about it. So in the 9th grade, I read the Reddick book, the Reddick biography of King. Of course, Reddick was a a close associate of King. He was a member of the inner circle of the Montgomery movement. And so learning about him in that way, I'd read lots of biographies, but this one caught me enough to read it 3 times in the 9th grade. And then led me to King's own book. So yeah, that book made an imprint on me. Those two books together, like nothing else. I've got it in my head that there's just even such a thing as theology, and the like. And so a certain, I think to put it this way, King represents something. I can see something in his story and now in his person and the way he speaks about the gospel, where it just seems to me like, wow, this isn't what church normally sounds like. This isn't what most people that I know who are religious, this isn't how they talk. And yet look at what it's doing for him. That is kind of throwing him into this struggle for justice, that it's enabling him in some way that it just seemed to me, firstly, it was formative as a kind of an example of someone who actually lives his faith in a way that looks like this, that isn't just kind of trivializing or just not just about personal morality or any such thing. It's got this kind of prophetic edge to it. So if that's my model of what the real thing looks like, now I'm just looking for more examples of it later on. So I did become I assiduously read all the books I could about the civil rights movement while I was in high school. And then, of course, then he was killed during that period. And so then he became not just this exemplar of a certain way of living the faith, and not just even a social justice political figure, but he became, once he's cut down, he's a Jesus figure. I mean, he is a Jesus figure who died for us. Now this cross story that's been in my head for years in my youth, and now a very similar kind of cross story that is the story of Martin Luther King. These two things kind of fold together in my mind and feeling. And that, to me, that's what Christianity is. That's the basis, the crux of whatever theology I had in my head at the end of my high school years. But it has been ever since, despite all the other theologies and philosophies I've crammed my head with since then. There's something that took me into it that has been my crux all along. And then a couple of years into college, I read a fabulous book called Christianity and the Social Crisis by Walter Rauschenbusch, and now I'm seeing it again. Someone else who gets this social justice faith out of the Bible and speaks it in a way that's just brilliant. And it's politically radical, and it's democratic socialist, and it's biblical. And it's here again, I'm having this experience that I had previously with King, which is that, wow, this is what Christianity should sound like. And how come it doesn't? How come most of the time it doesn't sound anything like this? But then in that book, Rauschenbusch had whole chapters about that problem, about what happened to Christianity along the way, such that it doesn't speak its own kingdom language. It's not radical. It ends up being reactionary in all kinds of ways. And so Rauschenbusch was a kind of guide to me into something that is the kind of study of the history of religion and history of politics and all of it.
Rauschenbusch is someone we've talked to. Rauschenbusch is someone we've talked about before in past interviews, but just quickly, tell me again who was
he is the great figure of what I call the white social gospel. That he is the greatest in some ways. He's a very radical figure in the social gospel movement of the 1890s to the end of the First World War and then beyond. But he died in 1918, he wrote these just electrifying books there's just no question in historic terms, in theological terms, in social ethical terms, by any measure, by any angle. He is the great figure of that whole social gospel movement, which said that the church is simply betraying the gospel if it's not involved in struggles for social justice. And he was also, this is one of the anomalies or peculiarities about the social gospel. The most famous figures from that whole movement tend to be the more radical figures. So people who kind of wear the democratic socialist name, and without it, it's not state socialism. Usually it isn't. Most of them know enough about the history of democratic socialism itself to know that the real thing is it's cooperatives, it's guild networks, it's worker self-determination at the guild level or the firm level. That's what we need. We need our workers to be able to have democratic self-determination over the factories in which they work, where they are. So most of them are that kind of. That's how they fit into a democratic socialist narrative. And so there are debates about that. Church people are like, that's a little scary. We don't need to bring socialism into this. It's just too hard of a thing to sell people on in this bastion of capitalism in the U.S. So that's very much an issue between the more radical wing and a more liberal reformist mainstream progressive wing of the social gospel. But they both of them speak a language of economic democracy. Both of them have this argument about, the teaching about the kingdom of God. That is the key to Christianity. And it's we get.
What does that mean? What does that mean? The kingdom of God is the key. What does that mean?
Yeah. They all have this story because they grew up evangelical, and they heard this preaching about the kingdom. Even it's even in the Lord's Prayer. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth. And they all just thought of it as, that's about getting yourself to heaven, being saved for heaven, because they grew up evangelical and that's what they were told. And so then they all have this story about once they, as they would say, got social ideas or were converted to social justice, or for many of them, where the social gospel came from. It's people like Washington Gladden confronting an emerging trade union movement. And this emerging trade union movement of the 1880s and 1890s in the U.S. is saying to them, that is to these Protestant church leaders, we know you're the enemy, and you're not with us. And it hurts their feelings. No, we want to be for the workers. And they say, no, we know where you are. We know who pays your salary. And when it gets hard, you're never going to be on our side, because the church never is. The church kids itself about this, that it thinks it's neutral, or it thinks it's a kind of arbiter between labor and capital. But this is life or death for us, and we have to know who's on our side, and that doesn't include you. Well, that hurt the feelings of people like Washington Gladden and Richard Ely and Walter Rauschenbusch when they heard it. And they resolved to do something about it, which is quite remarkable in a way, because these unionists were right. The people paying the salaries of these Protestant ministers are, it's the capitalist class. And so it is a hell of a thing to found a social gospel movement that's saying, actually, we've had the wrong questions. We've not actually applied the gospel in the way that it really is, the way we should. And we need to do something about that. That is as strong a cause, an impulsion to create the social gospel as anything else, just a response to an emerging trade unionism. Now, I hasten to add, of course, that's always the case on the white side of the social gospel. On the black church side of it, you just don't even have the luxury of saying, well, we pay a lot of attention to what's going on in the trade union movement or anything else. That's the period of American history where you've got a lynching movement. My God, it's just a mania of lynching going on. And the 14th and 15th Amendments are just being erased in the whole former Confederacy and now spreading. And so in a black church context, what it means for the church to be involved in struggles for justice, and mobilizing churches to join reform movements, there's no question what's number one. That's just a given. You don't even have they have no choice about what that is. And so, we've talked about this previously. I've got this whole argument about how different social gospels intertwined and did not. And that my argument is that the social gospel movement that came out of black churches, the black social gospel movement, is actually the greatest religious movement that we have in this country.
When you talked about Martin Luther King Jr. a moment ago, it was very clear to me, listening to it, watching you talk about it, that was a religious experience for you.
Yeah. Oh yeah, definitely. And it was in itself, I mean, there are plenty of books out there where you could just barely even know that King was a preacher, and where that's just kind of screened out. A lot of historians don't know how to deal with it, and they've just got to translate King into their terms. And indeed, that's an academic necessity. If you have something that's as deeply religious as that was, but you've got to make King accessible for your field in political science or philosophy or a secular history department or so on, of course, you're just going to you're going to strain that out as much as you can in order to make it accessible, even palatable, within your field. But then we end up with these books about King that just aren't quite right because they just don't get the deep spirituality that's in it.
Gary Dorrien is the Reinhold Niebuhr Professor of Social Ethics at Union Theological Seminary and Professor of Religion at Columbia University. He is the author of his autobiography now. Author of many books. His latest is the autobiography. It's called Over from Union Road, My Christian Left Intellectual Life. Gary Dorrien, before we began our conversation, I said that there is just so much I want to talk to you about that I hope this would just be one of a number of interviews we do maybe over the next couple months, to talk more about these things, because there's a lot here, impossible to get through in 50 minutes. But I'm deeply thankful to you today for taking this time.
Oh, thank you, Mitch. I'm so grateful to you. I love talking to you, so we can do it anytime.